Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with part 2 of my August wrap-up. I will link part 1 down below, but I read 22 books during the month and I could not do it all in one video, so here is the second half of the books I read. The next book I finished was The Crimson Crown by Cinda Williams-Chima. This is the fourth and final book in the Seven Realms series, and this was a very emotional ride, and I loved every second of it. I really loved the characters and how far they have come, and especially Raisa. I love her so much. Looking back at how frustrated I was by her in book 1, she has come so far and I love her so deeply. And just the characters overall were really well done. I love Han as well, and I think the antagonists in this book are also so interesting and so complex. Micah Bayar in particular, I just think he is a fascinating character. I also really love the side characters, and especially how Cinda Williams-Chima, she takes characters that you think are just there to illustrate something, you know? They're there to be a more important character's girlfriend or brother or friend or whatever. She gives you this sense of their backstory and she makes them important in the story that she's telling, and I just loved that. I think the plot of this one was so fascinating, and even though it was very political, it still felt very well paced because I had to keep reading. I had to know what was going to happen and how everything was going to work out. And on the political fantasy front, it always felt very believable why these people weren't agreeing or why it was taking so long to decide a particular thing. And finally, the ending of this one was just so good, and there's this one scene in particular that's the very last scene in the book where it's I didn't even know this was something I wanted, but I did, and it was beautiful and I loved it, and I gave The Crimson Crown 4.5 stars. Next, I finished A Study in Charlotte by Brittany Cavallaro. This is the first book in the Charlotte Holmes series, and I buddy read this with my lovely friend Katie from A Sea of Tomes, and this was actually chosen by my friend Rocky as part of my BookTube Friends Choose My TBR, and this is one of Rocky's favorite series. I think everyone who follows her knows that. And Rocky, I'm gonna say you might want to skip this part of the video because unfortunately I really didn't like this book. Before I get into the things I really didn't like, I'm gonna start out with some sort of storytelling choices that I just personally felt were very odd. So other people might not see it as a negative, but I kind of did because it felt unsupported or unnecessary. So first off, I didn't realize before I started this that Charlotte and Jamie are both British, which wouldn't have been a big deal except that the setting is in America. It's at an American boarding school. And I don't really know why the author did that. I understand if she wants to keep it more similar to the original by having the characters be British, but then it's why would you set this in America? It kind of felt like the only reason she did that was to make an even greater contrast between the two main characters who are smart and worthwhile and all the other idiots who go to the school. That's really kind of how it felt. And another thing is I just don't buy it. I don't buy this whole they're the descendants of Sherlock and Watson, but they're literally the exact same as those characters. I don't get that. Is being Sherlock Holmes hereditary? Is being Jamie Watson something that just gets passed down from generation to generation? I understand family tendencies and wanting to follow a certain tradition, and sometimes that was kind of alluded to, the way that Charlotte grew up. It's sort of implied that the family does this because they have to live up to Sherlock Holmes's memory, but it's never really said flat out, to the point where it's kind of this doesn't make sense. Even the Moriartys are apparently they're all the same as the Moriarty from the Sherlock Holmes stories, and I just didn't understand that. And then the last thing that is just a weird storytelling choice is I don't get why the author chose to summarize so many of the Sherlock Holmes cases and spoil them for no reason. It didn't feel necessary. There was no reason to use so many of the stories. There was one or two points where it made sense for the plot, but they didn't have to spoil the reveal in a really boring way. I don't get why that was done. So those are kind of all the things where I'm this just didn't make sense to me. And now the things that I really didn't like about this book. So the characters, Jamie and Charlotte. I realize I haven't given you a summary for this book, but I feel like everyone knows what this is about. They get framed for murder at their boarding school and they have to team up to solve it. That's all that happens. So the characters are so flat and so repetitive. I've already mentioned how they're basically just carbon copies of their famous ancestors, but even beyond that, it's they have no growth, no development. I do not understand the relationship between them at all. I don't get why they care about each other. I mean, I kind of see from Jamie's perspective, he's kind of been obsessed with the idea of Sherlock Holmes for a long time, and I've heard that gets called out a lot more in further books, because he really puts her on a pedestal in this one, and I know that gets better later on, and that's a very deliberate choice on the author's part. But what I don't understand is the point where we're supposed to realize they do really care about each other. I don't think Charlotte gives a shit about him. And even on Jamie's side is like, I don't understand, like I don't feel like there was ever a point where he started liking her versus the idea of her that he had. I understand that like that gets commented on in later books, but I think you still, even if you're planning to do that with a later book, which I think is kind of risky because people might not want to stick around to see it, even if you're planning to do that with a later book, I think you still have to give some reason for why these characters actually want to spend time together, because I didn't understand it at all. And speaking of characters, Charlotte, I wanted to like her. I wanted to like her so bad, but like the not like other girls feelings that she has are just so strong, and to a point where like it can't just be excused by Jamie being the narrator and like thinking she's like the pinnacle of all women. It's like Charlotte herself is like this too, and it was just infuriating. Like just to see how she looked at other people, and especially other women, was just like, I hated it. I hated it so much. There's this one point in the book where she has to disguise herself as basically like, I don't know, like a dumb slut, is like, for want of a better phrase, like that's really kind of what she's trying to embody in order to get information out of horny teenage boys. And guess how she does it? She makes her skirt shorter, she puts on a lot of makeup, she puts on a blonde wig, and she affects a California accent. And like, this is what turns her into like a hot bimbo who everyone is powerless in the presence of. And I just hated that so much. I was just so like deeply offended by that, because it's not challenged by the book at all. Like there's never any moment where she recognizes that what she did is sexist or misogynistic. And I understand that she's using it to like get information out of people. Like she's got this very like practical mind, obviously. So you could argue that like she's justifying it like by the ends that she's trying to achieve, but that was never said. So we're kind of left with this scene and thinking like, because it works is the problem. So it's like the story itself is telling you that this is how women are and this is how men respond to them. Like that scene just enraged me so much, and the way it was handled was also just really bad. And then speaking of characters, Jamie's dad can go fuck himself. Like, I hate him so much. I hate how we're supposed to be charmed by him, even though, like, oh yeah, he did some bad things in the past. Like, he cheated on his wife, and he abandoned his son, and he, like, put him in a situation where he knew his life could be in danger, like, for the fun of it. And it's just, like, he seems to be a fan favorite, and I truly do not understand. Like, I assume there's character development for him later, but as of this book, he can just go choke. Also, the, like, main mystery of this book is kind of dumb. Like, I don't really... It was just very annoying to me. Like, I remember reading a review on Goodreads, I'll link it if I can find it, that was like, after finishing this book, I still don't really understand who the murderer is or what they wanted. And I remember reading that, I think it was Bose Harrington, I remember reading that review and being like, how can you not be sure about that after finishing a mystery? And I understand now, because like, the whole reveal was so confusing and so ridiculously overdramatic, and it just didn't work for me. And finally, another thing I really hated about this book is the way that drug use and disordered eating was handled. It was so flippant, or it was even like glorifying it. Like the way that Charlotte Holmes, like, she has struggled with drug addiction before, and there's one point where Jamie actually thinks to himself that he wishes he would have done hard drugs so that he could be better able to help her. And I'm like, Jamie, no, that is not your job. And just the way that Charlotte was, it was portrayed as part of her like cool and unattainable girl personality. Like the fact that she was like a drug user, and the fact that she never ate. It was like this whole like broken bird kind of thing, which I hated. It took her like 20 minutes to eat an almond. Like, that's not quirky. That is an eating disorder. And I don't care if it's because you're so smart that you can't stand to spend any time on something that's not your science lab. Like, young girls are reading this. I mean, even as an adult, I read this and was uncomfortable and was like, this could really hurt somebody. Like, the way that this is shown as being like part of what an interesting character she is, it was just disgusting to me. I really hated this book. The only thing I think it had going for it was that the writing was pretty good. I gave it, it's probably around like a 1.75 stars or 1.5. Next, I finished The Bone Garden by Heather Kastner, and I actually won this arc from a Twitter giveaway from the author, so thank you so much. And I really loved this. This is a story about Uriel, and she is a girl who's kind of been created out of bones and magic, and she serves her mistress, I think Madame Vesper is her name? Miss Vesper. And Miss Vesper is always telling her that basically if she displeases her, like, Uriel doesn't really exist. She could just like snap her fingers and disintegrate her. Miss Vesper is a horrible person, in case you can't tell. And so this story is about Uriel wanting to learn who she is. Like, she wants to be a real girl. And so finally one day Ariel flees Miss Vesper and goes on an adventure to try and figure out like why she was created and how she was created and if she can actually become a real girl. I really enjoyed the writing. I think it was a perfect blend of like spooky and whimsical and like funny too. Like, I just loved Ariel and her friendships because she meets a couple of friends along the way, and I just loved all of them and how much they cared about each other. And Ariel herself, I just instantly fell in love with her and her story, and I just wanted her to be happy and loved. And the same thing for her friends, like the other characters, I just really just wanted them to be happy and to realize that they are enough. I love the whole like atmosphere and vibe of this book. It's kind of like the writing in that it was a little bit spooky, a little bit sweet, and a little bit melancholy, or more than a little bit. There's quite a bittersweet feeling, but the sweetness is enough to make up for it. Like, it's not just bleak and depressing. And I really like the sort of mystery element. Like, it's not exactly a mystery, but there are some questions that Ariel is trying to get the answers to, and I think when we found those out, it was really effective and really interesting, and I really liked that. And I also like the small scale of this story. In a lot of ways, it is a very small story. Like, there's not a lot of different settings. Like, the world that Ariel lives in is very restricted because of who she is and the fact that she can't go outside where people can see that she's like a creature made out of bones and dust and magic. So her world is very contained. And even when she starts to explore outside of that, the story is still kind of contained, but I think that really worked. Like, I really liked that because we really got a feel for Ariel's character and the other characters and this very specific setting. And I just think it was so beautifully described too, and I really, really enjoyed this. I believe the book has already been released, and I highly recommend it. I gave The Bone Garden 4 stars. Next, I finished March Volume 1 by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. This is a nonfiction graphic novel, the first in a trilogy actually, about the life of Congressman John Lewis and his involvement with the civil rights movement, and I really enjoyed this. I've been hearing wonderful things about this, and I thought it was fantastic. I really loved the art style. Let's see if I can show you a little bit. I really liked the art and the really powerful storytelling. Like, I think the writing and the dialogue of this graphic novel was also really well done. I love how specific it was about John Lewis's fight for civil rights, and I learned so much about him that I didn't know before. And especially, like I said, the specificity of it, like little details that you might not have learned in school or through other methods when you were learning about this time, like the specific ways that the students would train themselves to resist violence in a nonviolent way was just really powerful and just so interesting and hard. I just really enjoyed this. The one thing that I didn't think worked as well is there were some times where the speech bubbles were so small that I couldn't read what was said in them. And I don't mean like the stylistic ones. There were a few where it was clearly just like background. It seemed like there were a few times where the speech bubbles were communicating information about the story or about the people in the book, and it was just too small to read. So that was kind of frustrating, but other than that, I loved this and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I finished Amal Unbound by Aisha Saeed, and we follow our main character Amal, and Amal loves learning and school, and she wants to be a teacher someday. She's very happy with her life until one day she has a run-in with the corrupt landlord of their village, and she gets taken away as an indentured servant in order to placate him, and it's about her trying to adjust to this life and her realizing that because of this one choice, this one person, it's like her whole life has changed and she feels like she can't do anything about it. And so the book is about her like trying to make a difference anyway. And this was just such a wonderful story. It's inspired by the story of Malala Yousafzai and her fight for women's education and girls' education. Amal was so brave, and I really admired her and I really liked her, and just seeing her strength even in all of this adversity was just very affecting to me. And she definitely has setbacks, but it's very understandable why she feels the way she does. And I just love the focus on learning and reading and how important those things are, how those things can really open up entire worlds to people. And I was also really impressed by how clearly this book communicated the horrible reality that a lot of people still deal with. Like the fact that Amal, this young girl, she talked back to this one person and her entire life was changed for the worse. Like it made me so angry, but it was also very, it was a very powerful part of the book because that is the truth. That is how some people live. So that was very effective. And I also love the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Like that's a very trite way to put it, I guess. But that really is kind of the feeling I get from this book, and it's supported by Aisha Saeed's author's note in the back, is that she wanted to tell a story about how, like, you don't always know the names of people who make these wonderful changes in the world. The one thing I didn't think worked as well was the writing it felt very different from the short story that I've read of Aisha Saeed before. Like, it was very straightforward and almost plain, and I did eventually adjust to that. And I don't think it like ruined the reading experience or anything, but given what I had read from Aisha Saeed before, I expected something a little different and a little more rich, I guess. And actually in some places I think that the straightforward writing style really helped the emotional impact, and it kind of made you feel like the immediacy of Amal's situation and the reality of her world. So I think eventually it actually really worked for the story. It just kind of threw me off guard at the beginning. And I gave Amal Unbound 4 stars. Next, I finished The Last Guardian by Owen Colfer. This is the 8th and final book in the Artemis Fowl series, and of course the last part of our Artemis Fowl read-along. I will link our live show down below as usual. And this is a very bittersweet experience, and this is actually my least favorite book in the series, but I give it huge points for like the emotional punch that this book had on me. And I also want to say thank you to all of you who joined me and Taylor and Giselle on our read-along. Thank you so much for your participation, and I hope you enjoyed the experience. As for this book, like I said, not my favorite in the series. I ended up giving it 2 stars, but this is still one of my favorite series I have ever read, and it's one I will continue coming back to. And as far as my feelings on this book, I'm just gonna read from my Goodreads review. Decided to rip this one off like a band-aid, and surprising no one, I am still an emotional wreck. As with the other 2 times I read it, I have so many issues with the way this book goes. Story inconsistencies, out-of-character moments, horrible events going completely unaddressed, but I give it points for a few wonderful scenes and sheer emotional devastation. Not the ending I would have wanted, but Artemis Fowl is still one of my favorite series I have ever read. I will continue to love it and reread it, though I reserve the right to skip this book whenever I feel like it, and or pretend it never happened in the first place. I will actually link some bonus content about this book. It's a translation of the code at the bottom of this book, but I will say that has huge spoilers for the whole series, and especially for this last book, so don't read that unless you have read all of the books in the series. But if you just want more emotional pain and details about the story, I encourage you to read that. We actually talked about it in our live show quite a bit. Very mixed experience with this one, but I still love the series. Next, I finished A Posse of Princesses by Sherwood Smith. And in this one, we follow our main character, Rhys, or Riss, I'm not actually sure how to say her name, and she is a princess, and she gets sent to celebrate the birthday of a neighboring prince, and it's basically an excuse to get a lot of young ladies from the rest of the kingdoms together in one place, and everyone's kind of assuming that this is how he's going to choose the woman he's going to marry. So a lot of Rhys's time is spent at the castle, and then one of the girls goes missing, and her and some of the other girls have to band together, go on an adventure to bring this girl back. And I really, really enjoyed this book. Not that I wasn't expecting to, because obviously I wouldn't have picked it up if I didn't think I was gonna like it, but I was just really surprised by how much I loved it, by how much I loved Rhys, and this book gave me like the female friendship squad that I have been craving. I loved it so much, seeing Rhys make friends with these other girls, and just their, like, the closeness of their bonds and the way that they support each other and tease each other and love each other. It was just, I loved it. It was balm for my soul. And I did really enjoy the romantic relationships in this book as well. What really stood out to me is the friendships between these women. I also just loved Rhys herself, and can we get a hallelujah, because she actually was allowed and encouraged to enjoy feminine things. I think it is really important to show that girls don't have to be interested in dresses and dancing, but it is really nice to come across girls once in a while who it's like, hey, you can like being in a pretty dress and dancing at a ball, and you're still a strong woman. I also found the world of this book really interesting. Like, I think the world building was very unobtrusive, which I really liked. It was like, you really got a sense of these different kingdoms and how they functioned, and there were a lot of complexities about them actually, but it didn't feel overwhelming. And just the characters overall, I really, really loved all of them basically, and I just had such a fun time reading this book. The reason I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 is because the ending felt very strange to me. It didn't seem to fit with the rest of the story, and looking back, I can see how some things were hinted at early on, but there were a couple parts in particular that felt very anticlimactic to me, and in a way, I admire that because it is very different from, I think, how a book like this would like normally end. So I appreciate the skill of Sherwood Smith, but I'm still like, oh, I would have liked something a little more satisfying for that part. And also, speaking of the ending, I didn't really like how one of Rhys's close friends, like, her character was just, it seemed like completely changed in that last chunk of the book. It was like, oh, just kidding, like, she's not as like interesting and complex and like wonderful as you thought she was. I didn't like that. I didn't feel like that was supported by the rest of the book, so that did kind of frustrate me a little bit, but overall I still had a ton of fun with this, and I gave it 4 stars like I said. Next, I finished Gaslight, and in this play we follow our main character Bella, and it becomes clear very early on that something is wrong with her marriage. We don't trust her husband, she doesn't trust her husband really all the way, and so the play is about figuring out what is going on, how much of the scary things that are going on in this house are Bella's imagination. And first off, I do want to mention that this is in fact the place that we get the term gaslighting for, so the psychological abuse of making somebody doubt their own reality. This play is where it came from. I actually came across this story first in the wonderful movie with Ingrid Bergman. I just love that film. I think it's so well done. And I actually think I liked the movie a little bit better because unlike the movie, the play really doesn't make it feel like Bella is the main character of her own story, which I didn't like. I liked that the movie gave her more depth and gave her more agency, but I did still really enjoy the play. I think the atmosphere of this one is so good. Like this creepy, sinister feeling that you get from the play and from watching Bella interact with her husband, it's just really strong. I think the dialogue was very good, and I think just like the play as a psychological exploration is just chilling and so well accomplished. And I feel like this play is a really great example of how even before we had a term for something, it was still happening, you know, like just because we didn't have the term gaslighting before this play came out and became popular, it doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. Like you really see how society back then, even more than today, obviously these things still happen today, but back then society was even more set up to make it so easy for a woman's husband to do anything that he wanted to her. So overall, I would really recommend this play, even though the characters weren't as well done as I feel like they were in the film, but I still really enjoyed it and gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished When the Sea Turned to Silver by Grace Lynn. This is the 3rd and final, I guess, companion book in her folktales series, and I really enjoyed this. I have heard that this is the one you should read last out of the 3, and that is what I did. We follow our main character Pin May, and her grandmother is known as the storyteller, and one day the emperor and his soldiers come and take her away. And so Pin May takes her friend Yishan, and they go on a grand journey or quest to bring her grandmother back, and along the way they meet other people and they learn a lot about the power of storytelling. And I really enjoyed this. I've enjoyed all of Grace Lynn's books I've read. I think this is probably my 2nd favorite. I loved the folklore and the connections she makes between the stories and how they come full circle with the characters' lives. That's something I've been impressed with all of her books. And I really liked the characters as well. Seeing Pin May grow into her own voice and being like realizing that she has the power to do certain things was just really lovely and very heartwarming. And I love how like the ending of this one was really emotional and bittersweet in a way that I wasn't expecting for some reason. I guess like given the way the other 2 books ended, I was taken aback by how melancholy this one felt in some ways, but I think it was the perfect ending for this book. The only thing is that there were points in this book that got slower, that I felt like were kind of dragging a little bit. And also that I think the connections between these stories and between her other books would have meant a lot more if I had taken notes with those other books, which is obviously not this book's fault. And I did definitely see some of the similarities and some of the connections we were supposed to make, but I think this book would have been even more powerful and impressive if I had a clearer idea of the different characters and the different places in those other books, because in a lot of the stories, the names of people and places actually change depending on the events that happen to them, and I think that's one of the reasons I had a harder time following the connections between these books. But overall, I still loved it and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I finished When Women Were Birds by Terry Tempest Williams, and this is one of the strangest books to explain I think I've ever read. It's nonfiction mostly, but it's like almost poetry prose in some places. So I think the subtitle of this is 54 Meditations on Voice. And so like the setup for this book is a true story, and Terry Tempest Williams, right before her mother died, because her mother had cancer, and right before her mother died, she told her that she was leaving her all of her journals, but she had to promise her that she would not open them until after her mother was dead. And so Williams agreed to this, and then after her mother had died, she opened her journals and she went through them, and every single one of them was blank. 54 journals were blank. And so this book is an attempt by Williams, I think, to understand why her mother did this, like what these journals are supposed to mean. And as the subtitle implies, she also uses this as an opportunity to meditate on voice and what that means, and specifically what that means for women. And this was very interesting. This was a very weird reading experience. I think actually where this book worked best for me was the specific scenes and the parts where Williams was talking about her life and about her family and like very concrete events that had happened. There are a few scenes in particular I just thought were stunning. There's one where she's talking about a friend of hers and how she got her into the one of the movements in Africa about like inspiring women to plant trees and to like really take back some of their voice. That was really beautiful. There's this one scene where she's talking about her speech therapist and how it was her speech therapist who really taught her to love poetry and to love the power of her voice. Another one where she's talking about some hearings in Congress about trying to protect the wilderness in Utah, and just these beautiful vistas and wildlife areas that a lot of the politicians were wanting to get rid of for money. And that scene also was just really just beautifully told and so emotional. So I feel like the points of the book that were like that were just stunning. They were so well written, and I could just see everything so clearly. And I also love the really clear sense I got of her mother. Not that I understood everything about her, because part of the point of this book is that Williams is realizing that she didn't know her mother as well as she thought she did. But just getting a sense of the kind of person she was and what she did and her strength. I would love to meet like all of the women in her family, because they all sounded like such amazing and powerful women. But I just really loved the parts where she was specifically talking about her mother and memories of her mother. Unfortunately, the parts that I feel like this fell a little flat for me were kind of the meditations on voice part. I think when she moved away from concrete images into more stream of consciousness things, that's really where the book lost me. I felt like the writing wasn't as good. It kind of felt like she was just stringing sentences together that sounded profound but kind of didn't mean anything. At least to me, I didn't feel like those were as coherent as her other writing, and I understand that a certain amount of that is to be expected because she's talking about something so thematic rather than concrete, but I just feel like that part still could have been done a little better, because I feel like the kind of thematic point of this collection or of this book was like connecting those concrete memories and experiences to the idea of voice, and I don't feel like that always came through. There were a few things that I thought were very well said and profound and made me think, and it wasn't like every time she talked about the themes of this book it was confusing. There's this one scene near the end where she goes to the opera with her father. It was just breathtaking, and I think the way she kind of she framed that in reference to some of the ideas she had been talking about throughout the collection or the book, I think that was done so well, and I wish there had been more experiences like that where she did blend a concrete instance or memory with the thematic things she was talking about. I wish there had been more of that. And overall, I gave this book 3.75 stars. I do still recommend it, and I am very glad I read it. I just had kind of a mixed bag with this one. And finally, the last book I read in August was The Various by Steve Algard. And this is actually a book that my friend Aoife from Fred Weasley Died Laughing, she recommended to me in her Pairing Booktubers with Books video, which I will link down below. It was so wonderful. I really enjoyed that. And this was the book she mentioned for me. And I did really enjoy this. We follow our main character Midge, and she gets sent to live with her uncle. And she's not super happy about it, but she soon realizes that the surrounding wilderness area is inhabited by these magical creatures. They're called the Various. And she actually gets wrapped up in this conflict, like involving the Various and trying to save their forest that they live in. So I really enjoyed the world of this book and the lore and the Various and how their society worked. It was really interesting seeing that, and it felt very unique. And I also really enjoyed the cast of characters overall. Like, I loved Midge. She's so strong and spunky and intelligent, and I just really liked her. She's another one of those child characters that still feels very believable as a kid. I think she's like 11 or 12. She still feels very believable as a young kid, but not in a way that feels patronizing or condescending. Like, kids can be very smart. So I really enjoyed that she embodied that. And I also think the dialogue between characters was really well done. Steve Algard has a really great talent for specific voices of his characters, like the way that certain characters talked, like their accent or the word choice or just like the rhythm of their speech. I got such a clear idea for who all of these people were, like Midge and her uncle and some of the Various. There were a couple things I think this book could have done better. I think sometimes there were a little too many descriptions of the setting or of other things going on, and the pacing also felt a little bit, not inconsistent, but it's like we would switch back and forth between certain characters that were part of the Various and then Midge and what was happening with her. And sometimes it was like I just wanted to stay with one of them for a little longer, and we would switch to another perspective that I didn't think was as interesting. And then besides that, there was something I really didn't like that is more of a personal thing, and this could technically be considered a spoiler because it is something that doesn't happen until like near the end of the book, but it doesn't spoil like any of the big plot elements. So just keep that in mind, proceed accordingly. But I didn't like the way animals were treated in this book, and specifically, so there's three like main, I guess, animal characters you could argue. One of them is a cat, one of them is a dog, and one of them is similar-ish to a horse. And guess which one gets shot to death by a bow and arrow? it's the cat. And I've talked about this before, how I feel like there's a lot of inconsistency in the way that certain pets or certain animals are portrayed, and especially like their death or like cruelty towards them. And I really didn't like that. Everything about the way this cat died was just really upsetting, and it was like the author tried to make it better by saying like, oh, he was a really mean cat. He like bit people, and you know, he wasn't friendly. He wasn't actually a pet. He was like a working mouser. And I'm like, that still doesn't mean I want to see him like shot in the back of the head. And then the way his like body was disposed of, like they like fling him into this disgusting like swamp pit, and it's almost like a comedic thing, and it was just really, really disturbing. And there is some reference after the fact to Midge feeling uncomfortable with what happened and with what they did, so at least it wasn't just completely ignored. But like they never tell anybody what happened either, so it's like this cat was like so unimportant that they didn't even feel like they needed to come up with an excuse for what happened to him. They're like, well, like cats die all the time, you know, it's like he was half wild, like a car could have hit him, or like an animal could have eaten him or something, or like, you know, he could have wandered off. I just really didn't like how that whole incident was handled. And there was really like, it was really unnecessary too. Is like there were so many other ways that we could have had this conflict build, or like we could have had this problem solved that didn't involve this. So it kind of just felt like Steve Algard was like, this is the disposable one. It's easier to just like kill this animal and it's not a big deal. So yeah, I didn't like that. Like, personal feelings aside, I just think that from a writing perspective, it was sort of unnecessary to do it that way. So yeah, like I said, that is a very like personal feeling. As far as that element goes, I obviously love animals, including cats, so I really didn't like that, and I feel like there were other ways to write that. So between that and the more objective things I talked about earlier that I think the book could have executed better, I gave the various 3.5 stars. So I did enjoy it, but yeah, go in with caution. Okay, everybody, so that is finally all of the books I read in August. Let me know if you have read any of these, what you thought of them, and what your favorite or least favorite book you read in August was. I might have to do this split wrap-up more often, depending on how many books I read in a month, so hopefully you guys don't mind that too much. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!